All right, the title of my talk is The Heritage of Colonial Branding, Mahasweta Devi against Legal Orientalism. In November 1998, Budan, a young man belonging to the Kerir Shobar tribe of Purulia in West Bengal, was found hanged in the local prison. Initially declared as a suicide by the authorities, further investigation revealed that Budan died of the heavy beatings inflicted by the policemen that had arrested him for an alleged robbery. Of this charge, he was later declared innocent. Only 1 year later, another young man from the same district, Badra, was accused of having stolen 3 goods, some agricultural tools, and a fish net. Badra was taken out of his house by several village men and brutally lynched. Though alerted by the victim's wife, the police officers arrived on site only when Badra's dead body was lying on the ground. On the 19th of November 1999, the well-known Bengali writer Mahasweta Devi wrote a letter to the Calcutta High Court demanding further investigation into Badra's death, and mentioned Budan's case as an example of the violence still affected those tribals that were once outlawed by the Criminal Tribes Act. The Criminal Tribes Act is a British colonial law that declared some indigenous communities as criminals. It was passed in the northern regions in 1871, extended to other Indian provinces in 1911, and repealed only after independence in 1952. Between 1960 and 1998, Mahasweta Devi remarks, more than 50 Kerir Shobars have been killed by the police or mob lynched. This paper looks at the historical role of the CTA. I'll call this Criminal Tribes Act, CTA from now on, in enabling contemporary violence and social discrimination. I reflect on how Orientalism can be a useful analytical tool to explore the making of the colonial law, and then I move on to highlight how Mahasweta Devi's writing challenges the Orientalist legacy of this law. The CTA, just to give you a bit of the background of the law, criminalized smaller tribes that had, I quote, no place of residence, no lawful occupation, end of quote, and were thus considered doomed to cause offense to the colonial authorities. A public notification in the local gazette outlawed entire groups whose members had to be fingerprinted, had to register in police stations, and adhere to strict regulations of movement. Reformatory settlements were then established with the formal intention of assimilating the notified tribals into civilized society. In those premises, largely managed by the Salvation Army after 1908, they were trained in factory jobs and forced to low-paid work. The founding principles of the CTA were modeled on a previous legislation on bands of robbers and professional murderers known as thuggies, or thugs. The act against them, which dated back to 1836, relied on the assumption that criminal intention could not be assessed only as a result of a specific criminal act, but in relation to the characteristics of a collectivity, and then it could be inherited. Nomadic groups like thug gangs, dacoits, and wandering tribes, feared by the colonial rule that at that time was expanding its tax settlements and reinforcing its police system, became both the targets of the British rule and the object of a discursive construction of colonial law. In her study on the despotism of law, that's the name of the book, Radhika Singha underlines that the framework of rational rule instituted by the British was informed by the dominant paradigm of utilitarian and liberal thought, And it is this paradigm that enabled the orientalization of indigenous mode of community organization. That's what I argue. Liberal values such as private property and individualism, for example, were enforced via the forest law that ruled out community land management and progressively pushed Adivasis out of the forests. Similarly, the Land Acquisition Act, that now is on the spotlight because it's being revisited, had the effect, for another time, had the effect of othering indigenous forms of social organization not complying with liberal Western values. The CTA reinforced this logic and criminalized entire groups whose nomadism presented not only a threat to colonial surveillance, but also to Victorian social principles. The formation of reformatory settlements, in fact, constituted the ultimate attempt to bound nomadic groups to a delimited territory. The criminality of indigenous people did not only lay in genetic traits, but in the distance from the sedentary society that, according to a Darwinist view of social development, relegated tribes to the bottom of the scale of civilization. This Orientalist view of social development constituted tribals' inferiority by depriving them of political subjectivity, and in turn, sustained their criminalization. Orientalism surfaces here as a dispositive of production of alterity in the colonial representation of outlaws, and in the use of specific narrative techniques to portray these criminalized groups. C.A. Bailey stressed how in the narration of Ontagis, and all the narration on Ontagis that we have inherited as documents by British colonial authorities. So in the narration of Tagis, the picaresque character of these gangs of murders contributed to transform them into the most celebrated case of Orientalist myth-making, giving shape to the crime novel The Confession of a Thug, as well as to Steven Spielberg's more recent Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Like Bailey, Singer, Nigam, Schwartz, and others refer to Orientalism to describe the biased, fragmentary, and often erroneous interpretation of local customs that supported the acts on Tagi and Dacoity suppression, as well as the CTA. In brief, permeated by the canonizing of private property and individual Victorian social values, by views and prejudice of local administrators and sedentary native elite, as well as by social Darwinism, the knowledge informing and supporting colonial laws was intrinsically Orientalist. It is important to clarify here that the expression legal Orientalism in my title does not refer to the existing literature of comparative legal studies dealing with non-Western law. Instead, I want to stress the importance of Orientalism in the cultural sources of law. And I also highlight how law disempowered colonial subjects, depriving them of their political subjectivity. I make reference here to Pierre Laldar's work on law and Orientalism, which sustains the importance of the legal field in carrying out epistemic violence. Law erases previously existing spheres of knowledge by imposing new rules, instances, and practices. It establishes norms and codes of behavior and spreads a discourse supporting the colonizing mission. Inhabiting the subject, law aims at taming Oriental subjectivity to align it with the colonizer's need. For Aldar, I quote, "Colonialism offers us a history of a legally instituted subjectivity," end of quote. The colonial legal enterprise is an Orientalist project since it's founded on the assumption that law helps reducing the ontological gap between Western civilization and colonial subjects, while at the same time it constitutes and maintains that gap between the colonizer and the colonized as insurmountable. The enforcement of legal principles over colonized subjects had shaping colonial subjectivity, and in turn legitimizes the patrolling function of Western legality. Law institutionalizes the creation of the subject of the West and keeps, at the same time, the West as the subject of universalist narrations defining humanity and legitimate ways of being political. It establishes the norm against which other values, ways of associating and expressing dissent are regulating. Dissent is particularly important because in the configuration of dacoity and dacoit gangs, there is a certain group of anthropologists that maintains that dacoits were expressing dissent against the colonial rule. They weren't just acting as criminals. The CTA orientalized a specific subject position and constituted it as hostile to liberal values and sedentary society. Notified tribals were deprived of their political subjectivity by virtue of the criminalization of their whole group. Fear to harm the colonizer state's authority, for them, the rule of law was directed towards ruling a collective, not the individual. But the loose definition of the criminal communities that stays in the law created a fluid space of prosecutorial license within the legal framework. This legal pass, crystallizing the idea of criminal tribes, survived the empire and was inherited by the post-colonial government. After proclaiming the denotification of the affected tribes in 1952, no awareness was spread among the citizens about the abolition of this British law, and the government passed the Habitual Offenders Act in 1959, which preserved most of the provisions of the former CTA. So they weren't anymore just notified tribals or denotified tribals, but habitual offenders. As Mahasweta Devi repeatedly states, the colonial formation of indigenous subjectivity could not be undone by simply stating the non-truthfulness of the British Act. Instead of erasing the colonial bias, denotification can be seen, I argue, as highlighting the Orientalist legacy informing notions of legality and subjectivity. For Devi, social Darwinism and criminal anthropology that legitimated outlawing tribals reverberate within the modern nation, where they are still branded as habitual criminals. This critique emerges both in her activist writing, and I quoted from one of her letters at the beginning of this talk, and in her creative works. On one of these works I'm gonna pause now until the end of the talk. It is the short story Little Ones, which puts under trial the enduring effects of anthropological and criminology and on social discrimination. By the early 20th century, it was common opinion that criminal tribes were different from ordinary human beings. In fact, as late as 1928, the British traveller William John Hatch took it upon himself to assure his readers that the physique of the criminal castes, as he calls them, when fed properly, differed very little from one of the other castes. They do not have, I quote, they do not have that flattened head with ears low down and long, which suggests a criminal. End of quote. Reminiscent of this background, Little Ones deals with the marginalized tribal community of the Agaria, whose members, due to malnourishment, have unusually small limbs. The narrative point of view belongs to a young and good-intentioned relief officer in charge of setting up a relief camp in Lori, in the zone of Ranchi in modern Jharkhand. He is promptly advised about the hostility of the place. I quote, "It is a dumb, terrible place. The inhabitants have no honest way of living." End of quote. Mission houses there have the jobs of correcting Adivasi's lack of civilization. And the jeep driver introducing the newcomer to the area is quick to comment on the tribal closeness to animality. He says, I quote, "Animals, all of them. When there's a famine, they dump their kids at the missionary gate. They say, if they stay with us, they'll die." End of quote. And then, listen to them sing. Would any civilized person sing like this at such a time? End of quote. The curtain of prejudice in Lori is thickened by fear. The nearby forests, in fact, are the shelter for small and mysterious creatures that come out to steal at night. Described as not like human children, the thieves have been seen but never caught. Nonetheless, their subhuman physical aspect proved their association with criminal activities. During the officer's first night of guard, 2 sacks of rice are stolen, and he starts chasing the gang of robbers deep and deeper into the jungle. Once he reaches the crowd, here they stand, and I quote, "in a circle around the sacks, like crouching animals." End of quote. Those people's grey hair and sagging breasts force the young man to realize that he's not looking at children, but at adults. One of the old men reveals that they belong to the Agarias of Cuba, who disappeared after revolting against a displacement project. Forceful land expropriation for them meant abandoning the hereditary occupation of mining and iron trade, and agriculture proved to be an unsustainable occupation in an arid place like Lori. The man states, "Just 14 of us left. Now the rest are dead. Our bodies have shriveled and shrunk from lack of food. The men can only piss. They can't get up anymore. Women can't bear children. So we still relief. We must eat and grow again, mustn't we?" The relation of cause and effect connecting criminality and bodily difference is here dismantled with the introduction of a third cardinal element, induced poverty. According to the suggested subversion of paradigm, it is cultural and legal Orientalism that authorized discrimination and contributed to the inhuman state of denotified tribals. Their lack of access to substantial citizenship rights, including education and welfare, challenges the common understanding of what it means to be a citizen. But they don't just claim an extension of rights. Rather, in the short story, they question the legitimacy of their dispossession, defending a right to steal. We must eat and grow again, mustn't we? The story ends stressing the revengeful aspect of the tribal's animal appearance, which stages a revolt against modern rationality. And this is my last quote from the short story. "They cackle in ghoulish, vengeful glee. Then they circle him, laughing. Their penises rub against him, reminders that they are men, adult Indian males." The Agarias are among those citizens that, as Devi stated in the letter on Badra and Budang cases, the state and its machinery have failed to protect. In the conclusion, their naked, neglected, and dying bodies expose the failure at the heart of democratic citizenship. Citizenship, Devi's literature denounces, is clothed in an Orientalist and colonial heritage, and in the othering of native bodies through charges of animality and criminality. Thank you.